If you walk across Boston's City Hall Plaza today, you'd never realize what's right below your feet. And that's fair enough, since for the most part, the surface looks more or less like any other urban space along the East Coast. Though looks can be deceiving, since remarkably, about 15 feet beneath City Hall Plaza is a forgotten trolley tunnel from 1898, and it was part of the first subway system in the United States. This hidden chamber once carried streetcars beneath two stations that no longer exist, and it's not an isolated case, since the secret tunnel is just one piece of a much larger story. In fact, the city of Boston has up to 5 abandoned streetcar tunnels sealed off beneath ground, not to mention the several lost subway passages that were later webbed between them. Meaning, under the streets of Boston lies a broken patchwork of abandoned portals, side tunnels, and sealed platforms. So, how did Boston end up bearing so much of its original transit system, and what remains of that today? Stay tuned to find out as we uncover the rise and fall of Boston's forgotten streetcar tunnels. I'm your host Ryan Sokash, and you're watching It's History. When Boston first took shape in the 1600s, it wasn't the sprawling city we know today. Rather, it was a small, windswept peninsula called Sawmut, linked to the mainland by just a narrow strip wide enough to pass things like carts and foot traffic. Even so, the settlement grew because everything pointed towards a priceless asset, the harbor. It was the city's lifeline, the doorway for trade, the source for food, and the reason people gathered here at all. Though this particular orientation towards the harbor also had drawbacks. According to the Massachusetts Historical Society, early Boston streets bent and twisted to meet the waterfront, rather than offer any sense of symmetry, ultimately giving the young town its famously irregular layout. So, as the town expanded, its development exacerbated these crooked paths to the point that the resulting street grid wasn't a grid at all. It was a maze, carved around hills, coves, and property lines. Walking from one end of Boston to the other in the 17th century meant navigating tight alleys, steep inclines, and sudden bends that felt closer to a medieval port than a future American metropolis. But at the time, this worked because life was dense, local, and anchored to that famous Boston harbor. Though, practically speaking, people still found efficient ways to move around, particularly by boat. Ferries connected Boston with Charleston, Cambridge, and other outlying settlements before roads became reliable. In fact, the first officially chartered ferry ran between Boston and Charleston and began its operations in 1631. That remained the fastest way across the Charles River for generations. With that in mind, overland travel was far more difficult. Roads were unpaved and often muddy, so people relied on horseback or wagon if they chose to go that route, but not everyone could afford those amenities. Hence, even in the early days, Boston was already experimenting with their subterranean spaces. That's right, long before rail tunnels were imagined, some of the city's wealthier residents built short underground carriage ramps and short chambers beneath their estates. According to the Boston Landmarks Commission, several of these brick-lined passages still exist beneath Beacon Hill and the North End. Sure, they weren't public works, but they revealed something important. The land could accommodate tunnels, and policymakers took note. They started to experiment with the land. For example, they transformed the landscape in an unexpected way when they built the Mill Creek Canal. Dug in the 1640s, it cut directly across the North End, connecting the Charles River to the harbor and allowing small boats to pass through the city's center. This waterway lasted for over 150 years, and its original route matches the area that roughly became Scollay Square. Anyhow, by the early 1800s, the city's growth accelerated beyond reason. Trade expanded, immigration surged, and neighborhoods began pushing outward from the old peninsula. With more people came more pressure on the infrastructure. Overcrowded roads and steep terrain made traveling to Boston slow and unpredictable. Though, to ease the strain, private businesses introduced the omnibus, large, horse-drawn coaches that followed fixed routes. They were bumpy and cramped and frequently delayed, but for the first time, they resembled a scheduled public transportation system in this new American city. This was a successful start, but the city still struggled with surface-level congestion. Hence, leaders began exploring more solutions about how they could go below ground. Despite Boston already having tried some underground experiments, like those private carriage tunnels we previously discussed, nothing in the way of mass transit had been tested, meaning what came next would prove the city's capabilities on a whole new scale: the waterworks. Boston launched its first major underground megaproject, the waterworks. Completed in 1848, the system was brilliant. It channeled water from a nearby lake through miles of underground aqueducts, tunnels, and conduits, creating what the engineers of the day called a city beneath the city, demonstrating that Boston could plan, dig, and maintain large underground systems. Knowledge that would prove priceless just a few decades later in the rise of what came to be known as America's first subway. By the time Boston entered the late 19th century, the city was still expanding. In fact, so quickly that its colonial street network could not keep pace. New neighborhoods were rising in the Back Bay, like Dorchester and Cambridge, and every single one of them needed a steady flow of workers to service downtown. And it's important to note here that Boston's center of gravity was no longer just the waterfront. It stretched outward in every direction, and the only technology capable of uniting such a metropolis was the streetcar. The transformation began in the 1850s, when horse car lines first ran through the streets. The rails made the ride smooth, which passengers appreciated, but even more importantly, the carriages became easier to pull, enabling routes to extend miles beyond what a horse-drawn coach could manage on open roads. This notion continued to expand, and within a generation, the West End Street Railway, formed by a merger of dozens of smaller operations, became one of the largest street railway systems in America. At its peak, it controlled hundreds of miles of track, employed thousands of workers, and owned more than 8,000 horses. That primitive network operated like a wheel. Everything radiated inward towards downtown and then funneled through the same narrow corridors right back out, particularly along Tremont, Washington, and Hanover Street, forming Boston's main arteries along the way. But by the 1880s, they were hopelessly overcrowded. According to the Street Railway Journal, Tremont Street was so congested that streetcars often stalled in what resembled a chain of wheels, horses, and rails. Riders frequently got off and walked because it was simply faster than waiting for the jam to clear. A state of affairs that only revealed a more profound truth: Boston's geography was becoming its liability. The peninsula was too small, the lanes too narrow, and the ridges too steep. Something had to give. In 1889, the West End Railway opened its first electric streetcar. The improvement was immediate. Cars accelerated faster, traveled further, and climbed hills that exhausted horses. And throughout the 1890s, the system continued electrifying as quickly as money and engineering allowed. I should also point out that with faster service, though, society began to form new habits in so-called streetcar suburbs like Brookline, Dorchester, and Cambridgeport, which in theory was possible, but history repeated itself once again, as now the new electrified system also got caught up in traffic. The reason was obvious: faster streetcars could not eliminate congestion. In a way, their frequency amplified it. The more service the company added, the worse the downtown bottleneck became. And according to some sources, throughout the day, Tremont Street was so congested that it became unusable by light rail. Hence, the Governor's Rapid Transit Commission concluded that no amount of surface-level expansion could solve the problem. The city needed a new layer of infrastructure that would bypass that chaos altogether. Something radical had to be done. The solution was obvious. Boston needed to bury its trolley system wherever possible, and they didn't waste any time doing so. Construction started in 1985, and it didn't exactly go smoothly. Tremont Street was torn open from Park and beyond. This blocked all through traffic, as teams of horses hauled away dirt by the ton, though some establishments tried to remain open, as giant timber beams were used to support storefronts in the affected area, as the engineers dug right beneath their foundations. According to the Boston Transit Commissioner's reports, onlookers filled the sidewalks daily to watch the so-called Great Excavation, marveling at the idea that trains, even small ones, would soon go beneath the common ground. Despite the chaos, the project moved at an astonishing speed. In just over 2 years, Boston's first subway tunnel was completed, a reinforced brick and concrete corridor carrying 2 tracks beneath some of the oldest streets in America. When it opened on September the 1st, 1897, the Tremont subway station became the first subway station in the United States, predating New York's by over 7 years. The design was simple but ingenious. Streetcars entered the tunnel through the public garden portal and stopped at 2 brand new underground stations, and the effect was transformative. For the first time ever, Boston commuters broke free from the gridlock above. And yet, the subway's real genius was its flexibility. Engineers designed it not as a standalone line, but as a trunk, a central artery where surface routes could dive underground, avoid the busiest parts of town, and then emerge once again. It was scalable, adaptable, and future-proof. With that in mind, just 1 year later, the system extended northward through a new tunnel beneath Cornhill Street, a stretch that would ultimately become sealed off for Government Center. Though when this line operated, 2 stations served the route: Scollay Square and Adams Square, access points that linked the stations to the now-forgotten tunnel beneath City Hall Plaza. Furthermore, streetcars from Charlestown and Cambridge entered through the Canal Street Incline, a dramatic, triple-arched portal beneath North Station. The Pleasant Street Station opened in 1897 and expanded again in 1898, directing lines from Roxbury in the South End right into the subway. Now, just beyond that, a southbound tunnel segment offered extra storage and turnback capacity. The same sealed platform is actually still visible behind the fence at Boylston Station today. In short, by the turn of the century, Boston had created an entirely new layer of mobility, a hidden city beneath the city, a network of portals, ramps, sidings, and tunnels that allowed the sprawling surface system to funnel through downtown at unprecedented speed. Though by the 20th century, the seeds of decline were already planted, as the entire system that those tunnels served was about to disappear. Now, to be clear, in the early 20th century, Boston's streetcar subway was still offering a great service, but the world above ground was changing fast. Modernization projects were reshaping the network. Basically, demolition of key transport infrastructure was masked to the public as progress. For example, in 1914, the Boylston Street subway was extended west from Tremont Street all the way to Kenmore Square, and as a part of that upgrade, the original public garden portal, the very first entrance into America's first subway, was moved into the center of Boylston Street and redesigned as the Boylston Street Portal. It was a subtle engineering change, but it marked the point at which planners began adjusting the network to new traffic patterns for wider streetcars and, ultimately, demolition. Next came Kenmore Square. In 1932, that surface-level streetcar loop in the square was already seen as outdated, so the solution was to just bury it. Kenmore Station was moved, and the old surface loop became a bus facility. As for Kenmore Portal, well, that was sealed. Though still, to the public, none of this yet signaled collapse. But these early shifts showed that the city was beginning to prioritize flexibility, land use, and traffic management over the legacy streetcar geometry. In other words, the political class sold the public an idea of progress, which, I remind you, would be trading a dignified streetcar for, ultimately, dirty city buses. And when the timing was right, they pulled the trigger on the whole thing. By the 1920s and 30s, personal automobiles were pouring into Boston at a rate that the streetcar system just couldn't match. New bridges, parkways, and expressways were built for them. Politicians, who were often under the influence of lobbyists, began to present rubber tires as the future and steel rails as a burden, something to be eradicated. The state finally took direct control of the system in 1947 and reorganized it as the Metropolitan Transit Authority, with modernization being the guiding word, a word perhaps nicer sounding than demolition of the streetcar network. But they were serious in their quest. By the 1940s and 50s, planners were pouring nearly the entire transportation budget into highways and parking garages. The MBTA notes that during this era, the region's streets and expressways were rebuilt around cars, and that rail transit, if it wanted to keep up, had to do so with less money and more competition. And it's pretty hard to imagine that rail lines, infrastructure once seen as indispensable, began to disappear. And disappear they did when Boston's modern subway opened. It effectively ended any excuse for continuing to operate the streetcar network. The downfall came fast when the Huntington Avenue subway opened in 1949. The streetcars serving what is now the 39 route were shifted into the new tunnel to bypass Back Bay traffic, a change that immediately made the Boylston Street portal unnecessary and led to its closure that same year. In fact, that move alone ended all streetcar traffic along Boylston Street, and in doing so, it made the portal obsolete. From that point on, the shutdowns continued in sequence. 1962 marked the end of the southern arm of the Tremont Street subway. The last streetcar to Roxbury in the South End ran through the Pleasant Street portal that year, after which the entire branch was just abandoned. The portal was covered, and a park was built on top. The tunnel to Boylston was walled off, leaving nothing more than a fenced-off Type 5 car as a reminder. But then, downtown saw its most dramatic disappearance. In 1963, as the city cleared Scollay Square and Adams Square to build Government Center and City Hall, the connecting tunnel beneath Cornhill Street was left in place and buried under the new plaza. With that, one of the oldest subway alignments in America was entombed. Meanwhile, the north end of the system unraveled more slowly. The Canal Street Incline, which was once the North Grand Portal linking Tremont Street subway to the Causeway Street elevated, lost purpose as the elevated lines were also dismantled, meaning when the Orange Line moved into new tunnels in 1975, the portal that once roared with streetcars vanished from the landscape. Across the river, Harvard's underground streetcar complex lingered well into the 1980s. When the Red Line was extended to Alewife in 1985, the old lower-level trolley yard and the platforms at Harvard Square were walled off from the public. Though today, trains still pass the darkened platform, but they serve no operational role. At this point, the public indeed started to feel a nostalgia for those old streetcars. But the logic was clear. Buses were cheaper, more flexible, and politically favored. Meaning cars continued to dominate the planning agenda. Just like that, Boston's streetcar tunnels were lost forever. Now, if you didn't know where to look, you might think that Boston left no trace of its streetcar tunnels. Indeed, decades of redevelopment, subway expansions, and highway projects have erased most of the old rail layouts from the city map. But the tunnels themselves, the ones dug in the 1890s when Boston first put its transit system underground, still exist, sealed and mostly hidden. Let's start with the Pleasant Street portal, sealed in 1962. On the surface, it's just a small neighborhood park beside Tremont Street, but beneath the grass lies the buried mouth of the old South End subway. Inside, the original two-track tunnel remains intact behind a concrete wall at Boylston Station, complete with the fenced-off Type 5 streetcar sitting where the last inbound train once paused. Just north of there lies Boston's most famous forgotten tunnel, the City Hall Plaza Tunnel, built in 1898 and sealed off in the early 1960s. Documentaries filmed during rare city tours offered archaeologists a small glimpse of what remains. This space is inaccessible to the public, but has been shown in rare documentaries where archaeologists give us a small glimpse into what remains. Original features such as those beautiful brick vaults are still standing, not to mention details such as the white standback line, which remains legible on the platform floor and was only recently rediscovered. Further north, the story continues at the site of the old Canal Street Incline. Nothing of the ramp remains. The last pieces were demolished during the North Station realignments and Central Artery project. The widened sidewalks, altered building footprints, and unusual geometry hint at where the incline once rose to meet the elevated line. Today, the Green Line runs entirely underground at North Station, but the incline's route remains in the old engineering drawings and in the way that the street widens slightly where the portal once stood. Across the river, the Harvard Station lower-level tunnels also survive, hidden in plain sight. When the Red Line was extended in 1985, the old underground trolley yard and platforms were permanently sealed off from public access. And thanks to that, riders can still glimpse at the abandoned platform as their train passes through. The tracks are gone, but otherwise, the area remains unchanged, a preserved chamber from an era when Harvard Square functioned as both a subway station and a streetcar hub. Finally, in the center of it all is the Boylston Street southbound tunnel, the stub leading towards the old Pleasant Street branch. Although it hasn't carried riders since 1962, it's still part of the physical layout. And that's the story of Boston's lost streetcar tunnels. I hope you enjoyed it and will consider supporting the channel by clicking subscribe or join. Otherwise, until next time, I'm Ryan Sokash, signing off.